67 degrees right now. The time 8:33 now. Continuing our 1-hour Newsmaker special today. And we have on with us for this half hour Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
So many things to talk about. First off, let's get your thoughts on the Senator John McCain funeral and the anonymous New York Times article, letter to the editor, I should say.
Well, I had wanted to make a comment about the McCain funeral because many people, of course, watched it on Saturday morning a week ago. I heard Robert Heinemann, my colleague here at Alfred University, talking about it on Newsmaker just last week. And Bob Heinemann made the point that it was inappropriate at a funeral to bring in political subjects, to bring in the kind of political comments that were made by a number of the people who offered eulogies to John McCain. And I thought that was a peculiar comment to make on the part of my colleague, if only because funerals for, over 2,000 years have often been political. Think back, for instance, I don't know whether very many of us will remember this, but when Julius Caesar was assassinated way back in 44 BCE, Mark Antony made a very, very political eulogy, saying that I have come here to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And then, of course, he went on in the rest of his eulogy to praise him again and again and again. It was a very, very specifically political comment that was geared to diminish the importance, of course, not the importance, but really the standing of Caesar's enemies, those people who, in fact, had killed him. And there have many, many other funerals have been, similarly political. So I don't think that one should be surprised that for McCain, who was a very political person himself, those eulogies should have been political. And I thought that they were really very, very impressive. They made the point again and again that McCain really did believe in the principles of Washington, the principles of Abraham Lincoln, and what was at the center of those principles? The idea that all men are created equal. President Trump wasn't there. He wasn't there at that funeral because he wasn't invited to be there. He was specifically told, he wasn't told, but McCain had made it very clear before his death that the president would not be welcome. And that itself was a political statement. And I think that one is going to have to come to terms with the degree to which there are very, very important issues of principle that divide the president, President Trump, from his adversaries, from his critics.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning, also the letter to the editor, the anonymous letter to the New York Times.
Yeah, it was more than a letter. It was an op-ed. It was an editorial, so to speak, that stands opposite the editorial page, and it's anonymous. And I thought that was what's kind of been, in the air since the publication, which is about 1 week ago now, is that most of the attention, and I think that Dr. Heinemann had made this point also in his commentary last week on Newsmaker, that a great deal of the attention has focused on who wrote it. Well, I guess that would be natural in light of the fact that it is anonymous. There's something of a history of this kind of thing, although not in the New York Times. I've been reading the New York Times for a long, long time, 61 years to be exact, and I have never, ever remembered an op-ed or any kind of a, anything other than a, regular, standard editorial being without a signature, being without a byline. In this case, obviously, it is without a byline, and, should the individual who have written this have, included his or her name? The answer is probably not. Probably not, although a lot of people argue that, this individual should have signed his name, assuming it's a he, and then simply resigned. But the op-ed would not have received the kind of attention that it has gotten had the name been there. I think what would have happened is that it would have been a one-day story, and we would have forgotten about it. We tend to have pretty short memories. But by not signing the name, it's still very much a part of the political discussion. But what I think is especially important is not so much who wrote it. It may have been written by one individual. It may, in fact, have been written by a number of individuals. We really don't know that right now. But what has, I think, been lost with all the focus on who wrote it is the substance of that op-ed, the substance of that editorial. And the substance of that editorial was pretty damning in respect to the president's position. We believe, it said, our first duty is to this country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. And this is we should remember that this was written by people who are very, very conservative. The root of the problem, the editorial writer goes on to say, is the president's amorality. Anyone who works with him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making. And that's a comment that would never have been made about John McCain, but it's often made about the president. And it goes on to say that although he was elected as a Republican, the president shows little affinity for ideals long espoused by conservatives. And those include, of course, free minds, free markets, and free people. At best, it concludes, he has invoked these ideals in scripted settings. At worst, he has attacked them outright. This is a pretty serious statement by people who presumably are inside of the White House. And while, we don't know who wrote it, I'm guessing sooner or later we will know who wrote it. I think it's had an effect on conservative support for the president.
Talking with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. And Dr. Ostrower, wanted to ask you a question that I asked of Nick Waddy in the previous half hour. We talked about that mailer that's getting a lot of attention in the New York City media. It was sent apparently to downstate voters. It was about Cynthia Nixon, and it accused her of anti-Semitism. I wonder if you caught the story and if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I did not hear Mr. Waddy during the last half hour, but I do know a little bit about this story. I mean, to the extent that I've been reading the newspapers like, most other people these days. I doubt whether it's going to have much effect. I say that because many of those people with whom it might really have an effect, and that is the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. Okay, those are the people who are really, kind of hot to trot in respect to these sorts of issues. They are not going to support Cynthia Nixon. They view her as a potential enemy, not just an adversary. The charges that she's anti-Semitic have been floating around Brooklyn now for quite some time. There is a Brooklyn assemblyman, quite a well-known guy who has been, making these charges at least for the last 2 weeks. Those folks have heard this before, and they've made up their mind, and they weren't going to vote for Nixon in the first place. For other people, I don't think that is going to have much effect. It's become something of a controversial issue, which in some ways I think diminishes its importance. Should anyone take it seriously? I think the answer is no. There is no evidence from what I can see, and remember, I'm no expert when it comes to Cynthia Nixon, or for that matter, Cuomo, but there is absolutely no evidence at all that she is anti-Semitic. Quite the contrary. And so, we're going to have to take it for what it is. Yeah, I doubt whether it's going to have much of an effect.
Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower, our guest today. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us.
St. James Hospital is committed to providing excellent care close to home. That's why we've added 2 new general surgeons, Dr. Brian Watkins and Dr. Adam Bassler. They're both passionate about caring for people in communities like Cornell, and they bring expertise in the latest techniques like minimally invasive surgery. Dr. Brian Watkins and Dr. Adam Bassler, they're helping St. James provide the best care in the best place, close to home. St. James Hospital. Welcome to a healthy new day. Part of UR Medicine.
It's meteorologist Rob Carolyn on a primary day. Rob, what's the forecast for primary day?
If you're headed to the polls today, you may want to take the umbrella. There's a chance for an isolated shower this afternoon. It looks like we're gradually going to be getting better as high pressure builds down from the north. Right now, the skies are relatively clear out over Lake Ontario up into southern Ontario, but then it's cloudy across much of the state until you get up to about Watertown, on to Messina. And that drier weather will gradually filter in over the next 24 hours as high pressure builds south. It's going to be the system that actually protects the state from Hurricane Florence, which is less than 200 miles off the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina right now. For today, considerable clouds, maybe a shower, warm, 80. Sunrise this morning was at 6:49. Tonight it sets at 7:23. Showers then during the evening were partly to mostly cloudy overnight, 65 to 70. Clouds will give way to sun tomorrow. There's the risk of a shower, 80 to 85. Looking ahead to Saturday, Brian, nice day, partly sunny, warm, 80 to 85. And we should stay fairly sunny and warm right into Sunday.
And we're on with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, a lot of stories lately about the FBI and leaks in connection with the Mueller investigation. Did you have any thoughts on those issues?
Well, I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that the Mueller investigation is going to proceed at its own pace. There are not leaks. There are no serious leaks coming from Mueller's own team. This guy is a professional. He has acted in a professional way. He continues to do so. The president and his folks may be saying that, it's time to conclude this whole thing, that the investigation would be over by, September 1st, or the investigation's going to be over by Thanksgiving or whatever. None of that is going to have any effect on Mueller. The president says, it's all a big hoax, that it's a witch hunt. Well, it's anything but a witch hunt. There have been many people now have been indicted. A number have already pled guilty. The fact that they have pled guilty is, I think, testimony to the fact that there's a lot of substance to this investigation, and I think that the president has plenty to be worried about here. Whether he will ever actually testify himself, the vast majority of the public thinks that he should testify. His own lawyers are saying, no, he cannot testify, should not testify, because, he'll undoubtedly commit perjury. And, that issue of perjury, the issue of not telling the truth, remains, at least from my perspective, one of the key problems with the Trump presidency. The Washington Post, just this morning, has an article to the effect that the president has now, over, roughly speaking, 18 months or so as being president, has made either misleading statements or absolutely false statements, lies, over 5,000 times. In other words, over 8 times every single day. We've never, ever seen anything like this. I hope that we're never going to see it again. It erodes the president's popularity among those people, except for his his base, which remains, we don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30% or 35% of the public, although probably a majority of Republicans right now. But what he is eroding are the principles of truth-telling, and a democratic society cannot operate. It will not be able to sustain itself unless our public officials tell the truth. 100% of the time? No. No one is, truthful 100% of the time. But to mislead the public in the way that the president has on a routine basis, I think, is corrosive. It's like a cancer to the body politic. Just this week, he said, that his the operation of the federal government following the Puerto Rican hurricane last year was, how did he put it? It was a great success. Well, I don't think anyone believes that a hurricane that took over, approximately 3,000 lives, 2,975 lives by the official count, can be considered a great success. And, what the president tries to do is to convert his failures, such as at the Helsinki meeting with Putin or, the hurricane down in Puerto Rico. He tries to convert these failures into successes, and a few people probably believe him, but the vast majority simply understand that this is propaganda, that this is simply, as I said, the kind of thing that erodes our respect for the president.
Want to get back to current events in just a moment, but first I was on the This Day in History page. Dr. Ostrower, do you mind if we do a couple minutes of history?
No, not at all.
Great. 1971. The massacre at Attica Prison. Were you teaching at Alfred University at that time, Dr. Ostrower?
He was. You bet. I remember it well.
And what do you remember about that incident?
Well, it was a governor at the time, Governor Rockefeller, made some political decisions not to have serious negotiations or talks or whatever with the prisoners. They were holding a number of guards. They were holding a number of guards hostage. The governor decided, not to take the negotiations seriously. He sent in the state police, and the state police fired indiscriminately at the prisoners after day maybe 3 or day 4 of the hostage taking. They killed, I believe it was 9 guards. The state police did. They would initially say that the guards were killed by the prisoners, but in fact the guards were killed by the state police. And again, I don't remember the exact number, but approximately 30 of the prisoners were killed. There were many, many others who were of course, were wounded. And I mean, there was a doctor, for instance, by the name of Robert Jenks from Batavia, who spent about 12 or 14 or 16 hours steadily just treating the guards and treating the wounded prisoners or whatnot. I mean, there was some heroism that came out of that, but it was really a dreadful affair. And, if anyone wants to kind of follow this up, there is a wonderful book, a Pulitzer Prize-winning history book by a University of Michigan historian. Her name is Heather Thompson. She wrote a book called Blood in the Water, and it was published just about 2 years ago. It's relatively recent. And it is one harrowing account, one really, really, exciting account in some ways of what happened over the course of those 4 days. But the state has nothing to be proud of in the way in which it, contributed to, what essentially was a massacre.
Also on this day in history, 1993, Israel-Palestine peace accord signed. And that was 1993, and in 1759, Britain victorious on the Plains of Abraham. Did you want to take up either of those topics, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, yeah, the Plains of Abraham. That's near Quebec City, what today would be Quebec City. And the British forces, remember, at that time, Canada, really Quebec, but Canada was a French colony. And the British were, of course, to the south, with the 13 colonies over here. And what the British wanted to do was to toss the French out of Canada and to grab Canada as a British colony. And they are going to manage to do that. And one of the reasons they managed to do it is because they defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham. Again, this kind of open area near Quebec City. The British general was a man by the name of Wolfe. He was killed during that very battle. The French general was a man by the name of Montcalm, and he also died during that battle. Back in those days, the generals were right with their troops on the battlefield, not behind the lines with some kind of electronic communications to their troops. So it turned out to be a very, very consequential battle. And the reason it was so very important is this. Once the French were out of Canada, once the British had annexed Canada, had made it into a British colony, which they did in 1763, a couple of years after the battle, there was no longer any reason for the colonists to the south, and I mean the colonists in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, in Connecticut, New York, to rely on the British any longer. We didn't need them any longer. And so long as the French were in Canada, the colonists were fearful of the French. They were very anti-Catholic back in that period. The colonists were fearful of the French, and therefore they relied on the British to protect them. Once the French were out of Canada, the colonists no longer needed the British for security. And within a relatively short period of time, 12 years to be exact, the Revolutionary War began, and 1 year after it began, the colonists declared their own independence from Great Britain. Happy July 4th.
Now, on the 1993 peace accord, I'm reading from the History Channel here, after decades of bloody animosity, representatives of Israel and Palestine meet on the south lawn of the White House inside a framework for peace. The Declaration of Principles, the first agreement between Israelis and Palestinians towards ending their conflict. It seems like there's been a lot of meetings between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the U.S. is usually involved. Why does the 1993 accord stand out in this day in history pages, Dr. Ostrower?
The Palestinians, led by Yasser Arafat, from 1964, this is even before the 1967, what they called the Six-Day War, from 1964 had essentially resolved not merely recognize the State of Israel, they resolved to obliterate the State of Israel. Needless to say, the Israelis had other ideas about that. And so the two sides stood in opposition for years and years, literally for decades. And it was during that period that the Palestinians launched many, many different kinds of terror attacks on the Israelis. They would blow up a discotheque, or they blow up a pizza parlor and so forth in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv or whatever. In other words, yeah, there was a great deal of animosity between the two sides. And the animosity, again, I repeat, existed because the Israelis were absolutely determined to preserve their state, and the Palestinians were determined to obliterate that state. Finally, in 1993, the two sides were brought together by the President of the United States, at that time it was Bill Clinton, on the White House lawn. And as a matter of fact, the Israeli leader, his name was Yitzhak Rabin, wound up shaking hands with the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. Rabin was criticized in his own country for shaking hands with a terrorist leader. And he famously said, "You don't shake hands, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your former enemies." And of course there were high hopes that it really would lead to a peace. But in fact it did not. The Palestinians, when given the opportunity to actually sign a peace agreement about 7 years later in the year 2000, Arafat simply refused to do so. He walked away from a peace agreement that would have given the fact that there was disputed land between the two sides, an agreement that would have given the Palestinians 94% of the land that they claimed that they wanted. The only land that they would not have received was right around Jerusalem, having to do with some Israeli settlements that had been built there where there was a Jewish population. Well, they walked away from that, and as a result, the conflict, if you will, has continued to this very day. The Palestinians, of course, are now in the Gaza area, led by people who have been outright supportive of terrorism. I'm talking about the Hamas organization, and of course, the Israelis have built a wall between the West Bank, again, some of that disputed territory, and Israel itself, to prevent the terrorists from reaching Israel. It has meant, of course, that there have been many, many fewer Israeli casualties over the period since that wall has been built, but the real fundamental issue has not been resolved. Israel continues to exist, and there are many Palestinians, led by Hamas, who believe, as did many of the Palestinians before 1993, that Israel should simply cease to exist as an organized state.
Dr. Ostrower, we are out of time. I wanted to ask you about the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. Can we do that next week when you come back?
Happy to do so.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Gary.
My pleasure. So